Okay, excellent. So let's get going with our afternoon sessions. Welcome back, everybody. Our first afternoon presentation is from Dr. Paul Van Donkelaar and Karen Mason. Dr. Paul Van Donkelaar is co-founder and principal investigator of SOAR, Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research. He's also a professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus in beautiful Kelowna, British Columbia. His research focuses on the basic mechanisms of sensory motor control and the cerebrovascular, neurocognitive, and sensory motor aspects of brain dysfunction resulting from brain injury. We talked a little about you this morning, actually, in your background, so we look forward to hearing more from you. And Karen Mason is the co-founder and director of community practice for SOAR, again, supporting survivors of abuse and brain injury through research. She is also the former executive director of the Kelowna Women's Shelter and the executive director of Third Space Charity. A seasoned and passionate nonprofit leader, communicator, and community collaborator, Karen brings 30 plus years of career experience to her work advocating for survivors of intimate partner violence. We also talked about you this morning, Karen, and so we're really thrilled to have both of you here with us today, presenting on the work that you're doing, the very impressive work that you're doing, and letting us know about some of the tools that are available for service providers to implement to better support survivors of violence with a traumatic brain injury. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to you two to take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda, for the nice introduction. I just wanted to acknowledge that we're coming to you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Syilx people, on whose lands we do our work and as uninvited guests. So as Amanda has mentioned, we are co-founders of SOAR, supporting completely blanked.
Survivors.
Oh, supporting survivors of abuse and brain injury through research. My brain is clearly full. It basically is a project that looks at the intersection between brain injury and intimate partner violence. And so my background is in sport-related concussion. I spent kind of 20 years of my research career looking at sport-related concussion. So hockey and football players are kind of the big two that we think about in this space. And so there's a lot of great research on sport-related concussion, and I think a lot of change in the conversation around collision sports in particular over the last 10 or 15 years to make them as safe as possible, especially for young kids and their parents as they try to negotiate through deciding whether it makes sense for kids to play these sports.
So, but after this, long career doing sport-related concussion, 7 years ago, once upon a time, Paul was single, as was I, looking for love on Tinder, of all places. And we met and fell madly in love. I, at the time, was running Kelowna Women's Shelter and supporting women and their children fleeing intimate partner violence. And Paul was, as he still is, working at the University of British Columbia, doing sports concussion research.
A lot younger in that photo.
We do look a lot younger. We should use those photos all the time. And about 5-6 months into our relationship, I stumbled across this editorial, which connected brain injury to domestic violence. And there I was running a women's shelter. And this was a massive light bulb moment for me because it had never crossed my mind, been on my radar in any way. We didn't have training on this topic. We didn't really know this was an issue. And I thought, okay, hold on a minute. What if many of the women we serve who seem to sometimes maybe be having extra challenges, who seem to be difficult, what if they have a brain injury and we're not helping them because we don't realize they have a brain injury and we don't know what to do about it? So I immediately forwarded this article to my wonderful new boyfriend and said, what the are you doing studying athletes? We need to study women.
And so I responded the only way I could, which was to start looking at the research on the intersection between brain injury and intimate partner violence. And that took about 5 minutes because there basically is none or very little. And even now, 6 or 7 years later, there's a little bit more, but there's still very little, certainly compared to research on sport-related concussion. And so clearly there's a huge knowledge gap around trying to better understand this intersection and maybe more importantly, what we can do about it in day-to-day life. So we started SOAR, which stands for Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research. And so just to give you some context, it's a community engaged, multidisciplinary research initiative, and we'll get into both of those components as we go along. It's a collaboration between between UBC Okanagan and the Kelowna Women's Shelter, originally when Karen was in the executive director role. They still are a partner to this day. And we began collecting data in earnest about 5 years ago. There are three main goals of SOAR. The first is to do what we call explore, which is to characterize the incidence and effects of brain injury and intimate partner violence. And that's where what we do in the lab in terms of assessing brain injury in this population is my key contribution. The second component is to educate. So that's kind of this sort of thing that we're doing today, which is to make people who or help people who are practitioners working in the gender-based violence sector to know a little bit more about the intersection between brain injury and intimate partner violence. And then a third goal is to empower, which is to create better awareness and support services for survivors themselves. So this is being implemented in our context in something we're calling the Community Support Network, which we'll talk about towards the end. So in terms of the explore phase, the challenge here is the complexity. So in order to characterize specifically the impact of brain injury and intimate partner violence, it's important to consider all the other factors that contribute to the intimate partner violence experience. So to do this in terms of assessment and evaluation, we look at a number of different comorbid assessments. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, substance use, and then a tool that was developed by a colleague at Harvard University, Dr. Eve Valera, who's really the pioneer in examining the intersection between brain injury and intimate partner violence, the Brain Injury Severity Assessment Tool, or the BISA. So just to go into a bit of depth about the BISA, it's a series of questions related to incidents with a partner resulting in brain injury-like symptoms. So a question might be on the BISA might be something like, in the last experience or episode you had with your partner, did you see stars afterwards? Or did you have difficulty concentrating afterwards? And then there's also direct questions about the severity. So did you lose consciousness? Or did you have a period of where you couldn't remember things? So post-traumatic amnesia. And if they answered yes to any of the questions, then there are follow-up questions around how frequently this happened, when was the first time it happened, when was the most recent time it happened, and how long did the symptoms last? And the result of going through all these questions on the BISA is you end up with a score between 0 and 8. So a score of 0 means that you were exposed to intimate partner violence, but if it was physical IPV, it was directed to some other part of your body other than your head, face, or neck. It happened, if it did happen, it may have happened long ago, a year or more ago. And it maybe never resulted in loss of consciousness or post-traumatic amnesia. So that's at the lower extreme. 8 is the upper extreme. That meant that it happened very frequently. It may have happened, the most recent one may have been last week. And one or more times you may have lost consciousness or had a period of post-traumatic amnesia. So you really get this kind of gradation or I guess what I like to think of it as is a load of brain injury due to intimate partner violence episodes. And so we do all these measures of psychosocial assessments. We do the brain injury severity assessment, and then we bring them up to the lab and we do a number of assessments of different aspects of brain function that we've been doing for 20, 25 years now in my lab, looking at a number of different aspects. So we have the capacity and expertise to be able to do measurements of brain blood flow to look at cerebrovascular physiology. We do blood draws to look at blood biomarkers of brain injury and the injury response. And then we do a number of assessments of neurocognitive function. And then we correlate them to the brain injury severity assessment scores, and then take into account the comorbidities, the PTSD and the anxiety and depression, for example. So just to give you a sense of some of these assessments, just show you an example of an assessment of cognitive and sensory motor function using a device called a KinArm, which you can see in the background there is a bimanual robot device where the participant looks at a display screen, and in the context of the task that we use called the object hit and avoid task, they are meant to represent targets and avoid distractors that come descending from the top of the screen. And as the trial progresses, the targets move faster and faster, and eventually you start to make errors. and get less accurate. And so we have a segment of video here that shows this. I think in this example, they're meant to hit the vertical rectangles and the circles and avoid all the other distractor targets. So you can see here a participant doing fairly well at this task, maybe making a few mistakes here and there. And that's at a relatively slow speed. The target's moving down from the top of the screen. And as I said, as they get going faster and faster, you start to miss the targets and or hit the distractors accidentally. And the computer can characterize and evaluate and assess all those different parameters. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through and show all the cool graphs because we want to talk about all the different aspects of the project, but just to give you some summary of the evidence so far. Before COVID had hit us, we had collected data from just over 60 participants. When we looked at their scores on the brain injury severity assessment tool, we found that the majority of them, 92%, had experienced at least one episode of IPV that resulted in signs or symptoms of brain injury. We found that those who had experienced strangulation one or more times tended to have higher brain injury severity assessment scores. Indigenous women were absolutely overrepresented. So in our participants, 20% were Indigenous, whereas in the Kelowna area, only 7% of people are Indigenous. I mentioned that, we've been doing this research for many years on acute sport-related concussion in young athletes. And so we were able to do a comparison between people who were in that context versus these women who had experienced intimate partner violence, and found that the number and severity of the symptoms that they were experiencing were greater than what we had observed previously in acute sport-related concussion. The brain blood flow assessments basically boiled down to this characteristic of arterial stiffening. So the blood vessels going into the brain were less pliable or less able to change their diameter in response to changes in systemic blood pressure. And so that arterial stiffening was related to basically the severity of the IPV related brain injury as indexed by the BISA score. And arterial stiffening is linked in other clinical populations to long-term neurodegeneration. So this idea that these experiences have long-term consequences. And then in the object hit and avoid tasks using the KINARM, we found that there was a reduced ability to make these fast coordinated movements under these complex circumstances. So kind of the bottom line is that there's lots of evidence for repeated brain injuries due to intimate partner violence that resulted in chronic symptoms and have potential long-term consequences. So this evidence is kind of the foundation, the base for us to be able to move forward with the other aspects of the project under the assumption that, yes, brain injury is happening in this population. Now, what do we do about it?
So when we started this project back in 2016, one of the first things we did was a cross-Canada survey of about 150 women's shelter workers. We really wanted to find out how much they knew about brain injury and intimate partner violence. We wanted to know what their screening practices were, if they even had any, explore barriers to them screening for brain injury, and get feedback from these frontline workers on some of the top brain injury screening tools so that we could help maybe develop something that would be something they could use in their daily practice. And we wanted to develop recommendations around providing training and tools to them. So what we found is that at least 75% of shelter workers at the time had never screened a client for brain injury. And that was sort of in any kind of formal or informal way. They definitely told us they did not know about brain injury and its intersection with intimate partner violence. And they expressed that in terms of barriers to doing screening, which they really weren't doing, it was that lack of knowledge, the feeling like they didn't have the skill and ability, and they didn't feel like they had organizational support or any protocols in place in their organizations to support screening being part of daily practice. So the other barriers were limits on time and resources. Those of us who've worked in that context and who know others who do know that shelter work can be chaotic, busy, loud, and everybody's under-resourced. There was also some expression that there was worry that clients might not react well to the notion of being screened for a brain injury. So that was something we had to take into account. So in looking at the recommendations that came out of this work, we recommended formal policies and procedures on an organizational level, training and education for staff and for clients, because we know women often don't even realize or consider they might have experienced a brain injury. And if we were going to provide any kind of screening tool, that it be an informal tool that could be done in a conversational type way. We also suggested, as part of the recommendations, that these organizations come up with their own referral system. So when they did identify a client who may have experienced brain injury, they had somewhere, some resources to which they could send her for help. So in response to all of this, we developed a module of a tool called the Concussion Awareness Training Tool, specifically for women's support workers. It is an online course that's available in French and in English. It's 100% free, and it takes 30 to 40 minutes to take the course. Would highly recommend, if you haven't taken it already, to take it. It's full of really good basic information on signs and symptoms of brain injury, how to recognize, how to support, and a lot of resources that you can send people to. Since we launched it almost 2 years ago, we have had more than 550 people take it either on their own or in extended workshops. I've developed extended workshops based on the Concussion Awareness Training Tool, and I'm always happy to deliver them if anybody wants to bring me into your team to deliver the training. We've received excellent feedback. This is some of what we've received. We've had everyone from shelter workers to parole officers to child protection workers and lawyers take the course. It's currently being instituted as a requirement for all child protection social workers in BC, and we'll also be delivering it to legal aid intake workers and lawyers in the coming months. So that's really exciting. This just shows that it actually, as well as being interesting and compelling watching, it works. We have shown in research of more than 110 participants before they took the Concussion Awareness Training Tool and after, that they had an average increase of 13% and pretty substantial increases in those who recognized important red flags for high danger from brain injury in terms of potential severe health issue or mortality, and a 63% increase in those who knew the commonality of brain injury symptoms, and an increase in those who recognized what they could do in their work to support. So it's a great course to take. We also developed some resources that are, again, available in English and French, thanks to funding from the Federal Department of Women and Gender Equality. That work we did assessing different assessment tools with women's shelter workers pointed to an existing tool called the HELPS Brain Injury Screening Tool as a really good one to start with, because it's quick, it's simple, and it can be delivered in that informal conversational style. 5 basic questions that look at a mechanism that may have occurred in terms of someone being hit in the head or strangled. And then other questions that really talk about some of the signs and symptoms and problems that can come from brain injury. So we recommend that frontline workers use this more as a guide to a conversation. It's not a clipboard check off the questions sort of assessment. And that is definitely from the recommendations we received, that it's really just a framework for conversation. We also developed a series of brochures for workers and survivors. And we have one that's just a general brain injury and intimate partner violence brochure. And this one pictured on the screen, which is more of a deeper dive into strangulation, which we know is such a red flag for future mortality and has its own specific nuances in terms of signs or symptoms. We wanted to have something to address strangulation on its own. And all of those resources are available for download for free in French and English on our website. So highly recommend you get those and share them with whoever you want, because we want this information as broadly spread as possible.
The final phase of the project is called Empower, and it's implemented in what we're calling the Community Support Network. This is being done in partnership with a community brain injury support agency here in Kelowna. So the general idea is that it's a multifaceted intervention that includes aerobic exercise, mindfulness meditation, occupational therapy, counseling, and cognitive exercises. It also incorporates a very key role, which is that of a participant navigator. And maybe Karen, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was something, in doing this work, since we started this project, the foundation of being trauma informed has really led to everything we do. So in the psychosocial assessments Paul referred to earlier, those are done at Kelowna Women's Shelter by our research coordinator, who also works part-time at Kelowna Women's Shelter. We wanted the women to be protected and safe through every process, as opposed to just sending them off to some person they'd never met who's a researcher and having to do these assessments that could trigger them or re-traumatize them. So similarly with the rehabilitation program, we wanted to ensure there was someone there to support and hold someone's hand as needed through this process. So our research coordinator, who acts as our participant navigator, is the clinical counselor who also has lived experience with brain injury. She connects with all of our participants and is there to support them both through the rehabilitation program itself, but also in other challenges they might be facing. So whether it's housing, whether it's issues to do with the legal system, access or custody of children, this person is a really important factor in them successfully getting through this rehabilitation program and moving forward in life.
So then in terms of evaluating the community support network, we're doing it a couple of different ways. One is to use qualitative methods to identify gaps and barriers to accessing brain injury informed supports either in the healthcare system or within community health supports. And then the second is more direct survey of participants to measure changes before versus after the intervention on things like quality of life, resiliency, and neurocognitive function. And we've had one cohort go through a pilot sample of 4 participants who all have shown measurable improvements in these different aspects of function. And so I think, the bottom line is, even though there's preliminary evidence, it shows that if you have integrated, multifaceted supports that incorporates the different components of need, that then you can see certainly improvements right after the intervention is over. We're this week actually going to follow up, 6-month follow-up for these first pilot participants to see how well that those improvements have been maintained. So in terms of other research that we have ongoing, I had a master's student who finished last year looking specifically at the ethical legal considerations for screening for brain injury. And this is a kind of a question that's always been kind of hanging around in the background of a lot of this work is, it's great that you might be able to identify that a brain injury is one or more brain injuries have happened as a result of intimate partner violence. And from a healthcare perspective and providing supports perspective, that could be a very useful thing, but potentially in the context of family law and child custody proceedings, it may be weaponized. And so this study was a qualitative study that explored how brain injury from IPV affects the strategies and outcomes for women in child custody access disputes. And so the goal was to develop informed recommendations for future research in brain injury and in IPV screening, specifically in the context of legal proceedings. In terms of the methods that we used, the participants were 12 family law lawyers, and we used semi-structured interviews where we presented them using a technique called contrastive vignettes, which are just 2 different scenarios which vary on one key parameter. And in this case, it was the presence or absence of a brain injury due to intimate partner violence. And so we had a series of questions that we asked them about how they might approach those 2 scenarios in terms of their strategies from a legal perspective. So this is a very busy kind of flow chart of the different aspects that come into play in that emerged in the semi-structured interviews. Kind of the big overarching theme in all family law is the best interests of the child. There's very general themes related to family law in the broadest sense that the lawyers confirmed were very important to take into account, but had nothing directly to do with the fact that brain injury may or may not be present. These sub-themes are the things that we identified as factors that would be important if brain injury were to be taken into account. So education about the intersection between intimate partner violence and brain injury, the capacity of the client to be successful as a parent, but also their capacity to give and receive legal instructions was considered to be very important. And then a big one from kind of the assessment and scientific perspective is causally linking intimate partner violence to brain injury through physical evidence. So the idea that this needed to be present in order for the legal system to be able to take it into account. And so the impact of this is that if brain injury due to intimate partner violence was to make its way into legal proceedings, it actually would leave women more legally vulnerable due to a lack of legal precedent. So this hasn't really been taken into account previously to any great extent. An inadequate understanding of that link between IPV and brain injury, and then actual physical evidence that would help prove that the brain injury occurred from intimate partner violence. And so I kind of went through all of these, and I'm going to expand on them a little bit, but just this idea that more education is required within the legal profession to show the link between brain injury and intimate partner violence. So this idea that having legal professionals know about intimate partner violence and the possibility that brain injury is happening is very important. Knowing that that medical information can be weaponized against women and could be used to suggest diminished capacity to parent needs to be taken into account if brain injury diagnoses are introduced. And then just this causation focus on the physical evidence and being able to prove that brain injury may have occurred as a result of intimate partner violence. So IPV related brain injury leaves women legally vulnerable because there's this lack of legal precedent and understanding and difficulty establishing the links between the two. And in the end of the day, brain injury isn't really the problem, the system is the problem. And so, you know, let's go change the legal system to be able to accommodate the fact that brain injury is likely part of the intimate partner violence system. And so when it comes to screening, I think it requires careful consideration from an ethical legal perspective so that women are relatively well equipped to successfully navigate a system that is really biased against them. And so in terms of recommendations, this research showed that we need expert allyship. We need physicians and others who know how brain injury can be part of the intimate partner violence experience. We need absolutely a trauma-informed legal team. So again, more call for education about IPV and its relation to brain injury for lawyers and judges. And then some going into assessments of parenting capacity with open eyes and skepticism in terms of how brain injury from intimate partner violence may be incorporated into some of these decisions. And then finally, transparency and the right to opt out. So knowing that potentially a brain injury diagnosis could be used against them, making sure that women who are clients in legal proceedings have the appropriate information and agency to be able to opt out of that information as required. Other things that we're working on include ongoing lab-based assessments, looking at the blood biomarkers for brain injuries, as well as hair samples to look at cortisol responses related to stress and additional neurocognitive assessments. I have a new graduate student who's interested in the intersection between intimate partner violence and brain injury in the queer community. So we know that IPV is more prevalent in the queer community, but we don't know whether brain injury is equally more prevalent. So she was hoping to be able to get a handle on that. I have another student, Steph Ashton, who actually Amanda is co-supervising, who's interested in raising knowledge and awareness of the intersection between intimate partner violence and IPV and brain injury in RCMP and other law enforcement. So we have an internal grant to develop and implement and evaluate a simple virtual reality training tool, which would help raise knowledge and awareness in law enforcement. have another new graduate student who's a paramedic by training and is also interested in this education and training component to help first responders in terms of pre-hospital healthcare trajectories, make good decisions, ask appropriate questions that take brain injury into account. And there was one more, but I guess not.
So in looking at this topic, which you've obviously been hearing a lot about today, and we've been talking a lot about best practice and ways we can in our daily work support women who've experienced brain injury and intimate partner violence. I think we want to recognize some of the challenges of doing this work because they have to be taken into account. The reality of brain injury is invisible, and not just invisible, but the context in which it happens is invisible. It's not like an injury that happens during a football game that everybody in the stands sees. So that really makes it challenging to do this work. The comorbidities Paul discussed earlier, like PTSD, anxiety, depression, and trying to figure out what's causing what. The existing shame and stigma, lack of awareness and knowledge, not just about brain injury and intimate partner violence, but about intimate partner violence and trauma-informed practice in general. We have people who are experts in treating brain injury who know nothing about the nuance and complexities of intimate partner violence. We can't expect them to do an excellent job in serving this population if we don't arm them with trauma-informed practice and training tools so they can do this in the right way. Of course, with women who are still in the abusive relationship, there is the fear of repercussion from a partner. Because of brain injury, there is that inability to create a safety plan, let alone follow through with one and prevent subsequent injury. Lack of support, both from the system, in which there is no dedicated strategic pathway of care for women who've experienced intimate partner violence, and among family members and friends who don't understand it. That limited ability to rest and recover. We always speak about in sports, there's the return to play protocol. We don't have a return to life protocol for women who are often single moms, trying to work, dealing with brain injury, whether they even realize it or not. So that's definitely a challenge in providing support for women who've experienced this. And then there's the financial limitation. The community support network rehabilitation intervention that we've been piloting is showing promising results. And the only way we're able to offer it is through substantial funding through the government. If our healthcare system isn't ready to step up and provide funding for similar treatment for women in general, we're not really going to be able to help them. So these are just some of the challenges that arise in doing this work with this population in this very specific and nuanced context. In terms of your work every day, if you're working with a woman, and maybe you went over some of this in the earlier presentation from our folks at the Courage Center in Victoria who are doing such great work. But if it's clear, if a woman comes to you and she talks about how she was beaten to unconsciousness the night before, you're going to make sure she sees a doctor if she hasn't already. If it's clear she's had past experience with brain injury, you're going to try to refer her to a brain injury support agency in your community. But there are things you can do in your work. You can use the helps tool to guide that conversation and even just get some red flags as to whether a brain injury may have been part of this woman's experience. You can speak slowly, which I'm not very good at. Taking breaks, it's really overwhelming for someone who's experienced a brain injury to have to sit through something long. So taking breaks is important. Asking her to repeat information back so that you have a better sense she's understood what you're saying. The factors of light being difficult and seeming too bright and causing headaches or loud noises, you can dim the lights in the room. You can move to a quieter location. You can work with her to fill out forms. Often when a woman arrives for support, whether it's at a women's shelter or in a healthcare context, she's presented with a whole lot of forms she has to fill out, or she's given 5 links to 5 different forms online she has to fill out. These are not conducive to her success. So working with her to ensure she gets those things done and minimizing that time in front of a computer or a tablet, helping prioritize tasks and appointments. You can keep a supply of cheap little daytimer journals and work with her to help use those to prioritize appointments and be a little more strategic in how she functions in the world. And keeping cheap earplugs, sunglasses, and hats around, even that can help make a woman more comfortable in the work you need to do with her, whatever that context is. And the primary thing you can be is trauma informed. I spoke a little about this earlier. I don't want to take up too much time, and not knowing what most of you do in your day-to-day. You're probably highly trained in trauma informed practice, but understanding the effects of trauma and working within a context of knowing that these things are probably part of a person's experience, emphasizing safety in all its ways, physical, emotional, psychological, and most importantly, meeting women where they are and letting them make choices, helping them rebuild that sense of agency and control. We shouldn't be shooting anybody, no matter what we're suggesting or no matter how good we think our idea or treatment we want to offer them is. You can educate yourself. You're doing that by being here today. Take the concussion awareness training tool course. Reach out to me if you'd like to have some extended training on that with your team. The ABI Toolkit is a fantastic resource developed by colleagues at the University of Toronto's ABI Research Lab. If you are interested in learning more about this topic, this is the place to go. It is a deep dive and you can spend as much time there as you want. In terms of trauma-informed practice, the folks at University of Western Ontario have done and are doing some incredible work with the Equip Healthcare team. Highly recommend checking out their resources.
And with that, we're done. We just first like to thank our funders. We've gotten some major funding from the Department of Women and Gender Equality to undertake this project. And if you'd like to stay in touch, there are social media addresses as well as our email addresses, and we're happy to take any questions in the remaining time.
Thank you both so much. That was a fantastic overview of the research and the accomplishments that you've made and are continuing to make, and also some really practical tips that people can do on a daily basis when working with survivors. So thank you for sharing that. I'm monitoring the chat and I haven't seen any questions come up yet, other than Lisa would like to be connected to you, Karen. So I'll put you guys in contact after today to look at some potential training opportunities there for the Abbotsford Police. We do have a question here from Anna. How often do you see men with brain injury from intimate partner violence? Excellent question.
Excellent question. We don't, because our project is specific to women and those who identify as women. But we know from other research that's been done by colleagues of Paul's in Vancouver that men often experience brain injury, and it can be from IPV, absolutely. We also understand that a lot of men who perpetrate abuse have brain injuries, but it's not an area that we have worked on because our focus currently is women, but I'm sure it happens.
I don't want to put Tori on the spot, but I know that was her past history working with males. So I don't know, Tori, if you want to jump in and add anything there, if you have an answer.
Everyone. No, Karen and Paul, I was just sharing with everybody earlier about that being one of the candles here at the Cridge around prevention and really wanting to look at that intersection of brain injury in the perpetration of violence, and if that has been addressed, you know, if we're doing a good enough job at addressing that in our rehabilitation programs and ensuring that abusers and perpetrators of violence are receiving support services around brain injury as well in order to, you know, reduce recidivism and increase their activities of daily living and engagement.
Yeah.
Lisa's asked another question. It may be better answered by the forensic nurses who are up next, but she's wondering about, oh, you've seen the question. So are cadavers examined when it's known that the cause of death is strangulation? So I don't know if you have any response to that. APD has done some training around strangulation, trying to encourage its officers to recognize, ask more questions about this, assess it, document it. So, and I know Crown in Abbotsford as well is doing a lot of work there. So I don't know if you have any response to the question or if we'll follow up later.
I think that's a great question for the forensic nurses. We know, as you do, Amanda, from the work you've done with the Institute for Strangulation Prevention, that too often women don't show signs and symptoms and aren't given the right medical investigation and then can suffer a stroke or other within a year after that. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed much more closely, and I'm glad to see more policing agencies taking care of this to ensure women get that health care, but it definitely needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know you mentioned already as well, Steph's research, and I mentioned it this morning as well, trying to enhance the recognition of strangulation in police files. and understand how this can be better documented, how it can be better, assessed in terms of the questions that police are asking at the scene, because you're right, it's not visible in many cases. Brain injury is not visible in many cases. And so we need to be doing more questioning around this. So in the more recent training that's been put out for police in BC, there is a component on strangulation. Police are now receiving more guidance about that, but there isn't related training on head injury. And so there's still a gap there. And so ideally what Steph's research is doing with the virtual training tool will help police to understand how to look for these signs and symptoms, how to ask about them, and how to document them. And then we'll see that also trickling down into the other segments of the criminal justice system as we start to grow the awareness around the importance of simply asking these questions. Is this potentially present? And if it is, what are you experiencing and how can I support you? So groundswell of change is beginning to happen slowly, but surely we'll get there. Other questions from the audience? Thanks for the questions asked so far. Anybody? Just going to check and see if there is a hand up.
Hannah has one in the Q&A.
Yeah, caught that. So are either of you subject matter experts that could contextualize this issue in court? Or are you training doctors in how they can contextualize their findings in court for assault or aggravated assault files?
In principle, yes. But it's so early days. And some of this stuff that I reviewed in the presentation around the ethical legal implications are exactly that, right? You need to have subject matter experts who can make the link from a health and brain function perspective. And this is really early days in terms of trying to understand that connection. A key component that Karen talked about in terms of the complexity is how to disentangle the comorbidities from the brain injury itself, and how all of those things combined, are part of the experience and part of the effect that has on the person moving forward. But at the end of the day, these are all things that are very likely to have resulted from intimate partner violence. And so, making that link and being able, like you said, Amanda, in having collecting the appropriate data and documenting it appropriately, so that then there's a record to show that this is what we saw when we came and to the call, and here's the evidence that we collected. And then if there are follow-up assessments that could be done from a clinical perspective to be able to make that link as strong as possible, then I think you're in a potentially good setting. And if the lawyers and the judges who are overseeing the proceedings aren't also as aware as possible of this link, then probably doesn't matter how good your evidence is. If they're coming at it with their own biases, then you might not get the outcome that you like. So there is a lot of work to be done around improving knowledge and awareness across a number of sectors.
There's also the issue of the sort of the acute versus the chronic. So most of the women we saw, their most recent incident that might have caused a brain injury was at least 3 months prior, but they were dealing with chronic long-term signs and symptoms. And a definitive diagnosis of brain injury is generally from knowing the mechanism of injury and the signs and symptoms. So the work examining blood biomarkers, I dream of the day when a simple finger prick, like with diabetes, can be a definitive diagnosis of a brain injury, either acute or years before, because I think the court system wants that definitive black, white, and we're not quite there yet, which makes this even more complex.
And I wonder how this information would be received differently in the jurisdictions where you have a domestic violence specialized court. So we know that there's a handful of these across BC where you now have judges all the way through educated with special background training around intimate partner violence and the complexities of those relationships. And so I'm going to venture a guess that there hasn't been any training at that level yet around head injuries, possibly even around strangulation, because these are all relatively new concepts that are starting to make their way from academia into practice. But that would certainly be somewhere to focus your attention and try to gain some traction is in that world, maybe starting in Abbotsford.
And certainly with, as I think Paul mentioned, the new focus on an understanding of coercive control as a key factor in intimate partner violence gives me hope, because it's a loose thing, but it's absolutely critical, and it's this evil underpinning of all abusive relationships. So if we're now starting to see an understanding of that in the court system, I think we can get there with brain injury.
Yeah, and I also think I've seen some changes recently in terms of the criminal code. So outside of Canada, of course, we know in the States, the Strangulation Training and Prevention Institute has implemented, or their work has resulted in new policies, legal policies around strangulation being treated as a felony rather than a misdemeanor. And thankfully, a few years ago in Canada, we saw a shift in terms of the introduction of 267C, which is assault by, as they call it, choking. So we're starting to see a transition towards recognizing that things like strangulation are, a more aggravating feature when it comes to the nature of violence that's inflicted upon somebody. So we need to consider, head injuries in that same sort of context, that this is something that should be an aggravating consideration when it comes to responding to the incident, because of the lifelong impacts that it potentially has on the quality of life of the survivor of violence. And we talked earlier today about the civil case that I know you're familiar with, where completely different outcome in the criminal justice system than what happened in the civil system. It's one example, right? There's no others yet that we're aware of, but you're right, seeing coercive control being taken more seriously, seeing strangulation being recognized in terms of its lethality, we're starting to see the shifts in the right direction. But we need to keep the education going, keep spreading of the research going, and helping people to understand the relevance of this information. I wanted to go back to Hannah's question just for a moment, just to note, Hannah, that in the next presentation with the forensic nurses, they are considered to be subject matter experts who on a regular basis are asked to testify. And actually one of them will not be able to join us today because she's in court for a related matter. So you can maybe ask some questions there as well to the forensic nurses. Any other questions from the audience that we wanted to cover off? This has been a good discussion. I did have a question for you as well, if you don't mind. I have a couple. I have a lot, but I'm just going to narrow it down to just a couple because I know where to find you after today. So I had a question about, there's all these different tools out there, and I kind of touched on this on my presentation this morning. So you talked, for example, about the Adapted Helps tool, and then there was the Visa by Eve Valera. So there's a range of different tools that service providers could implement, but how do they know which ones to choose? What does it matter which ones they choose? Are there some that are best for shelters, some that are best for victim services or police, or does it just matter whatever you can get your hands on? At least you're asking the questions.
I think there are some that are better for certain contexts. In with the Helps tool, for instance, that one's used pretty broadly. I know a lot of brain injury associations use that one and recommend that one. And again, the fact that it's quick and simple and doesn't require you to be a medical expert or a clinician. And it's more of we're not diagnosing you, we're just seeing if there's a red flag and should we take further action. To me, it seems pretty broadly applicable. But there's also the CHATS tool, CHATS, which was developed by the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. And it takes into account strangulation, concussion, but it also looks at mental health assessment in terms of suicidality, which in their work with frontline women's shelters in the United States, they decided was a really critical piece to include. So that hasn't been validated yet, but that's an excellent tool for organizations if they want to capture more than just the head injury and by concussion strangulation aspect. And then there's the SCAT, which is a sports one.
Yeah, so I mean, there are like the Visa and other more detailed questionnaires that are probably more for kind of lab-based assessments of brain function following a brain injury. I would say the other consideration is the acute versus chronic situation. So the Visa, for example, asks, about all the things that have happened in the past, whereas certainly for acute brain injury questionnaires, it's about what happened yesterday or 2 hours ago when you had your accident and this injury resulted. As far as I'm aware, there's no intimate partner violence acute brain injury questionnaires out there.
No.
There are acute brain injury questionnaires that get applied to intimate partner violence settings in a very constrained set of circumstances, and so they're they're taking basically questions that are being used in people that have had car accidents or sports concussion and kind of adapting them to the context of IPV. All of those situations are important, right? For both the person as well as the person providing support to have a better idea of what the situation is, what the experience has been, and how they might be able to adapt and respond appropriately.
Thank you. That was one of the other sort of questions that I had is, do the tools matter depending on when the injury occurred, and how long on average is it, do we know, for an IPV survivor to, before that somebody finds out about that head injury? So with sports, it's almost instantaneous nowadays, right? We know right away. But when we're talking about a survivor of intimate partner violence, what is the average timeline between the injury and the disclosure of that injury? Do we know that information?
We don't.
In the context of the SOAR project, where we recruited through the women's shelter, it's on average a year afterwards, and the earliest we had was 3 months. So I think it reflects the kind of trajectory the person takes, so that they're in a abusive relationship and eventually they show up at the doors of the women's shelter, and that is not going to typically be the case, the day before they received a brain injury, potentially within intimate partner violence. And that contrasts with, say, the work at the Embrace Clinic in Surrey, where they're seeing people within a day or two of an episode. And, that's the classic acute brain injury setting that we've been using forever in sport-related concussion to better understand that situations. It offers a huge opportunity to look at the same sort of questions in intimate partner violence.
Because I don't think we'll be able to actually quantify the answer to that question until healthcare providers, who are a first point of contact, start asking the right questions, which is really what it all comes down to, because we know those questions aren't being asked. And even if they are being asked, they're often not being asked in a way that will get the right information, which will then say, oh, there has been a head injury. So it'd be nice to know what those numbers are, but we're not going to get there until we change practice on those first lines of defense.
Yeah. And speaking of practice, is there any different strategies you recommend depending on whether it's an acute versus a more chronic or what's the word I'm looking for, a longer term brain injury? So is what you recommend people do change?
Yes. Yeah. So in the analogy from brain injury mechanisms from other contexts like accidents or sport-related concussion is, the acute phase, the subacute phase, and then the miserable minority, as they call them, that suffer from persistent post-concussion symptoms that can last months or years after the injury. And so I think, all of the participants that we've recruited through a women's shelter absolutely are in that latter category of persistent post-concussion symptoms. And so, there is good research from the sports concussion world in people with PPCS, that you can do interventions and improve the quality of life, improve function, even months to years after the injury. And so the same sort of concept, I think, applies in the context of intimate partner violence in the chronic state. In the acute state, there's absolutely things that we know from brain injury, from other injury mechanisms, that you should do in the first hours to days after the injury. And then in the ideal world, things that you can start to reintroduce slowly over the course of the first week or so. That's in the ideal situation where, the person is in a context where they're in, a family or friends are there for support, that typically isn't present in the context of intimate partner violence, especially in the acute state where the person might be still in the relationship that caused the injury in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And Karen, maybe you can answer this, but in what ways can this sort of information about the fact that somebody sustained a head injury, how can that be considered in safety planning with the survivor?
Well, because if you've experienced that head injury, there has to be an understanding that the safety plan can't be too complex, right? It has to be as simple as possible. You have to ensure that perhaps there's someone else they share the safety plan with who can be the backup, who can remind them or help them and support them in initiating and acting on that safety plan. All those pieces, if we do all of our work through that lens of that brain injury is a factor, it changes our entire approach. It changes the sorts of words we use, the language we use, the length of our sentences, the amount we put on a document, where we put it. Does that safety plan exist on a piece of paper? Does it exist in her phone? Does it exist 10 different places? Because she might not remember 5 of the places where it exists and she has to reference it. I think there's a whole lot we can do creatively to support women who we know are dealing with these challenges.
Great, thank you. Simplifying safety planning, really, yeah, thank you. And the last question that I had, in case there were any others, I'll leave a moment for others to ask. just had to do with, I know that there are some people here today that work with offenders of violence who themselves, as has already been mentioned, may be victims of intimate partner violence or survivors from childhood abuse, for example. Can tools like the helps, for example, be used with this population to screen for and then provide support for those who are not recent survivors of violence, but maybe long-term, or again, the perpetrators?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to the extent that brain injury is and or a history of abuse is there in perpetrators, the more knowledge both survivors and supporters have about the potential influence of brain injury or a history of abuse has on where the person's coming from and meeting them where they're at, I think can be informative and helpful in terms of supports that are provided to perpetrators. Absolutely. So, it takes a broad approach to understanding the dynamic of these abusive relationships and how supports can be provided in an informed way to make things better in both cases.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you. And we've had some thank yous as well being expressed in the chat. Are there any final questions that the audience would like to ask today? All right, not seeing any follow-up questions. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. It's always fantastic to hear you both speak, and I'm so grateful that you were able to join us today and share some of your knowledge with us. So thank you again. I don't know if you're able to stick around for the final presentation, but we'll be taking about a 15-minute break now and coming back for the final presentation, which starts at 2:30 with our forensic nurses. So if you need to take a few minutes, step up away from your computer, take a bit of a health break, go outside. The sun is shining where I am, so hopefully it is where you are as well. And we'll see you back here at 2:30 to continue on with our final session of the day. Thanks very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.